I'm here with Herald from HSBC. Herald, let's talk about specific stock markets. We have a board that actually shows you that if you had invested $100 back in 2000, where you would be. And you can see some of the top performers, China's Shenzhen market, India Sensex, and then Hong Kong as well. What has been some of the drivers?
Well, first of all, if you look at these markets, you see there's a very wide divergence. So Japan is at the bottom, would only make you, I think it was just over $100 or something like that. So there's a big difference there. You also see there's different markets in China. But the key drivers to a certain extent have been very often that in Asia, certain industries have emerged out of nowhere and have become globally competitive. A very good example, India, for example, is at the top of that list. We've seen their IT companies. Y2K was a big thing 20 years ago. If you can't remember, we thought the computers would stop working in the year 2000. It was Indian software companies that started to investigate these matters. And people thought, well, these people are pretty good. We can do all kinds of other services with them. And so they built actually global businesses, pharma as well. So that's been a case. Now, of course, the rise of China, the economy has done enormously well. So we've seen a lot of new companies moving into these markets and have performed extremely well as well. So that the economy has emerged.
Herald, you talked about the differences in the Chinese markets, and I think that's an important point to make because the market composition is not the same. You know, the Shanghai is different, Hong Kong's Hang Seng is different, as well as Shenzhen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely, because this is a very important difference. If we talk about the American stock markets, most people think about either NASDAQ or S&P 500, or you look at the Dow Jones. But pretty much the S&P 500 and Dow Jones, there's not too much of a difference in that. In China, there are more than one stock market. Arguably, there are 4 or 5 at least. Beijing just opened up one, is really small. You got a kind of a techie market in Shenzhen where the tech startups go, but the big one is really Shanghai. And Shanghai is industrial companies, consumer companies, banks. One of the biggest ones is, for example, so here you see China, that is those 3 exchanges, Beijing, Shenzhen, and China, Shanghai, India. And that is really traditional companies, retailers, footwear companies, liquor companies, stuff like that. Hong Kong has got a lot of Chinese companies as well, but that's a separated kind of market. And that's where a lot of the tech companies are located. So you're talking about the Alibabas and the Tencents and Xiaomi and stuff like that. So very different markets. Now, if you talk about the Chinese stock market, we have to say which one you're talking about, because that can go down, but Shanghai can actually do very well because it's a very different kind of sort of stock market.
And then, so as an investor, how do you play China, right? You have A shares, which is really for domestic investors. Is it B shares? Would you actually think about looking at different markets where you can play China, like Singapore or Taiwan?
Probably for most investors, there are 3 ways to play China. Hong Kong is the easiest. If you can just buy stock in Hong Kong, you can go there. And as I said, it's mostly tech companies, but there are banks and all kinds of other companies as well, industrial companies, retailers, footwear companies, you name it. If you say, well, I don't know how to go to Hong Kong, I just want to trade in the US, that's easy as well. There are ADRs trading or Chinese companies listing in China, although the US has made it increasingly difficult for these companies to list there. So a lot of them actually delisting and moving to Hong Kong. And you can go to Shanghai. Now, that is not necessarily easy, but you can do that through Hong Kong. We call it the Stock Connect. You just need to sign a paper with your broker that you are willing to do that. And then in Hong Kong, you can buy Shanghai stock. And there's a limited list what you can trade, but most people it's more than enough. So that's another way of playing China. Or you simply buy an ETF on each of these markets.
Herald, we only have about a minute until we go to our next commercial break. What about the export-dependent markets? Traditionally, maybe China, but as well as Hong Kong and Taiwan. When I was there, we knew that they were very dependent on the U.S. economy being the largest economy in the world. Are you starting to see some sort of a shift where there's maybe less correlation and greater diversification around that, or is it still the same story?
Well, for China, it has shifted. So China used to be an export market. It is not anymore. the ones that are really export markets in particular are Korea and Taiwan. Taiwan makes your Apple stuff. It's big in Apple. So it puts the phone together, puts the chips in there, the cameras, everything. So anything with Apple, you can play through Taiwan. Korea is, of course, more Samsung-centric. It does memory chips, so it's a slightly different dynamic. But yeah, they got Korean car companies that sell all over the world, including Canada. Right. So they are very export-oriented. So if exports do well, the US and Europe do well, hey, these markets can actually perform pretty good as well.